Okay, today we are going to continue to talk about the governance provision. Governance provision that we need to construct a governance index. This will tell us how to measure a firm's protection to the shareholder. So the last group of governance provision, in this group, we supplement firm-level data that do not include provisions with state-level data on takeover laws. So we code the presence of 6 different types of the so-called second-generation state takeover laws and place them in this state group. Some of these laws are actually analogs of firm-level provisions we've already talked about in other groups, such as the first one, anti-greenmail law. It's very similar to what we already have in the other group. The second one is called business combination laws. This provision imposes a moratorium on certain kind of transactions, usually asset sales or merger and acquisitions. This transaction should be between a large shareholder and the firm, unless the transaction is approved by the board of directors. So with this governance provision, the company can delay the payment for between 2 to 5 years. The third provision is called cash-out laws. The full name is control share cash-out laws. This provision enables shareholders to sell their stakes to a controlling shareholder at a price based on the highest price of recently acquired shares. This works something like fair price provision, extended to non-takeover situations. The next provision is called Directors' Duties Law. It allows similar expansion of constituencies. Number 5 is the famous fair price law. As we've already mentioned in fair price provision, this law limits the range of prices a bidder can pay in two-tier offers. It typically requires a bidder to pay to all shareholders the highest price paid to anyone during a specific period of time before the commencement of a tender offer. It don't apply if the deal is approved by the board of directors or a supermajority of the target shareholder. The goal of this fair price law is to prevent pressure on the target shareholder to tender their shares, and they have the result of making such an acquisition more expensive. The last one, the control share acquisition laws, is very similar to supermajority provision. These laws require a majority of disinterested shareholders to vote on whether a newly qualifying large shareholder has voting rights. So for now, we've already gone through all these 24 governance provisions included in the governance index. The index construction is very straightforward. For every firm, we add 1 point for every provision that reduce shareholder rights, or in other words, increase managerial power. Almost every one of these 24 provisions gives management a tool to resist the different types of shareholder activism, such as holding special meetings, changing the firm's charter or bylaw, suing the directors, or just replacing them all at once. And there are only 2 exceptions among them. So now please write down the 2 exceptions among these provisions, which actually increase shareholder rights. This is from last week. Last week, we've mentioned that among all these 24 provisions, there are 2 of them. With the presence of these 2 provisions, we actually increase shareholder power. So can you write down these 2 provisions? Who are they? Do you still remember that? Anyone? The first provision, which actually increase shareholder rights, is cumulative voting. And the next one is secret ballot. The cumulative voting, yes, that's correct. Cumulative voting allows the minority shareholder to combine their total votes together. And secret ballot help the shareholder to keep their identity confidential. So both of them actually increase, or we can say that increase the protection to the shareholder. So in the real world, these 2 provisions are usually proposed by shareholders and opposed by managers. And moreover, both of them tend to be negatively correlated with the presence of other firm-level provisions. Therefore, we consider the presence of these 2 provisions to be increase in shareholder rights. So for each one of them, we add 1 point to the governance index when firms do not have it. And for all other provisions, we add 1 point when firms do have it. So from this table, we can find that how many percentage of firm is associated with each provision, and how this percentage changed between 1990 to 1998. As we can see, some of the provisions are quite popular and very common across different firms, while some other provisions are actually rare. As we've mentioned, the index construction is straightforward. For every firm, we add 1 point for every provision that reduces shareholder rights. Although many of the provisions can be made stronger or weaker. For example, this supermajority provision, the threshold can vary between 51% to 100%. Well, however, we made no stress distinction, and each firm is coded all provision as simply present or not present. So this kind of methodology sacrifices precision for the simplicity necessary to build an index. Another point we need to mention is that the index does not require any judgments about the efficiency or wealth effects of any of these provisions. We only consider the impact on the balance of power. So here we are not saying that any provision is going to increase or decrease firm value, or the provision is going to have a negative or positive effect on firm performance. And what we are saying is that this provision is going to increase or decrease shareholder power. Almost every provision gives management a tool to resist the different types of shareholder activism. And that's why we add 1 point to governance index with the presence of them. And the 2 exceptions are secret ballot and cumulative voting. We've already talked about that. These two provisions are usually proposed by shareholder and opposed by managers, and both of them are usually negatively correlated with the presence of other firm-level provisions. Therefore, we consider the presence of these two provisions to be increase in shareholder rights. So for each of them, we add 1 point to the governance index when firms do not have it. And for all the other provisions, we add 1 point when firms do have it. So this table is the summary statistics for G-index of US firms, US public firms included in Standard & Poor's 1,500 index. So as we already clarified the construction of the index, now we know that this G-index should range from 0 to 24. Now, here is a quick question. There are two companies, firm A. The G-index of firm A equals to 8. And another company, firm B. The G-index of firm B equals to 15. So the question is, the shareholder protection of which firm is much weaker compared to the other firm, A or B? Which one? B. Anyone else? Yes, the correct answer is B. Given the process of index construction, we know that the firm with higher or say larger G-index is associated with weaker protection for shareholder. It is associated with lower power of shareholder. This governance index is just the sum of 1 point for the existence or absence of each provision. So here we pay special attention to the two extreme portfolio. The first one is the dictatorship portfolio. These are firms with the weakest shareholder rights, with a G-index larger or equal to 14. And then the democracy portfolio. These are firms with the strongest shareholder rights when the G-index is smaller or equal to 5. This two panel lists the 10 largest firms. Okay. Here, the largest is defined by market capitalization in the democracy portfolio and dictatorship portfolio, respectively. The portfolio is constructed based on the G-index of the company in year 1990. And here we list the G-index for each firm in both 1990 and 1998. So for the democracy portfolio, we can find that most of the companies are very famous, established firms. And the portfolio construction is relatively stable. Okay, so out of 10 of them, 6 of them are still in democracy portfolio in year 1998. Well, however, the portfolio construction seems to vary a lot for the dictatorship portfolio. Among 10 of them, only 2 of the company still remain in the portfolio. So it could be that their governance level get improved, okay, such as these guys. Okay, so their governance level get improved. So they no longer belong to dictatorship portfolio. Or it could be that the company go bankruptcy due to the bad performance. But remember that why we want to construct this governance index is because we want to relate shareholder power to firm performance. And here is what we find. First of all, we find that corporate governance, or say G index, or say shareholder power, is strongly correlated with stock market performance. We can construct a portfolio based on the G index of each firm. The investment strategy is that we purchase shares in the lowest G index firms. Among those good firms in the democracy portfolio, and then we sold shares in the firms with highest G index from those dictatorship portfolios where the firm is associated with weak shareholder rights. And we find that this kind of long good firm, short bad firm is going to earn an abnormal return of 8.5% every year. And the G index is also strongly correlated with operating performance, or say accounting performance of the firm. From the regression result, we find that each 1 point increase in G index is associated with a decrease in Tobin's Q by 11.5%. This is basically saying that empirically we find a positive correlation between shareholder rights and firm performance. We have established this empirical relationship of G index with firm's return, firm value, and operating performance. However, since that firm does not adopt governance provision randomly, so this evidence does not itself imply a causal relation or a causal role by governance provisions. Indeed, there are several plausible explanations for our results. That's to say, we cannot infer from this evidence that good corporate governance, or say higher shareholder rights, is going to lead to better firm performance. There are still some plausible alternative explanations. The first alternative explanation is that weak shareholder rights can lead to additional agency cost. If the market underestimates these additional costs, then a firm's stock returns and operating performance would have been worse than expected, and the firm value at the beginning of the period would have been too high. So at the beginning of the measurement period, since that the agency cost is ignored, so at the beginning the firm value is overvalued. So later on, its value will be reverted back to the true value of the firm. And this happened to those firms with bad corporate governance. So if this hypothesis 1 is true, then we should observe some unexpected differences in agency costs across different firms. Empirically, this is actually what we find. we find increased agency costs at firms with higher G-index, and this can directly affect firm performance in several ways. For example, in these high G-index firms, they usually pay CEO higher compensation. They usually have lower total factor productivity or return on capital. They usually see changes in leverage consistent with increased corporate slack or large amounts of inefficient investment. So the empirical results support hypothesis 1. The second alternative explanation says that it could be that the managers can predict pool performance in the future, but investors cannot. In this case, the managers could have put governance provision in place to protect their jobs. While the provisions might have real protective power, they would not have caused the poor performance. That's to say, the poor governance provision is not a reason for poor performance. Instead, it is that the manager predicts that in the future, the firm performance is not going to be satisfactory. So in order to secure their position, they will put some provision in place to protect themselves. And from the ex-post perspective, it seems that the bad corporate governance leads to bad performance. So to test this hypothesis 2, we can analyze insider trading activities. And to see whether insider trading activity could be a function of G-index. So here is the logic. If governance provision were put in place by president managers, so these same managers might be net seller of their firm's shares. If the manager predicts that in the future, the firm performance is going to be poor or is going to be bad, then they might be willing to liquidate their shareholding of the firm to avoid future losses. But however, empirically, we find no significant relationship between governance and insider trading activity. So overall, we find no support for the second hypothesis. The third hypothesis is that maybe the correlation between corporate governance and firm performance is driven by omitted variables. So in order to test hypothesis 3, we need to investigate whether a large set of observable firm characteristics can explain the empirical relationship between firm performance and G-index. And in support of this hypothesis, we indeed find several observable characteristics that can explain up to 1/3 of the performance differences, including market-to-book ratio, the past return, institutional ownership, trading volume, and past sales growth. Okay, so what we find support explanation 1, explanation 3, but does not support explanation 2. This figure plots the different level of G-index, the average G-index across different countries. The sample period is from 2004 to 2008, okay, before the financial crisis, after the Enron scandal and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Here, an index of 100% means that a firm has adopted all 24 governance provisions. This figure is trying to tell us that The level of shareholder protection adopted by individual firm varies substantially across different countries. The G-index include all 24 provisions followed by IRRC database. Some of these provisions are actually controversial, which means that we are not quite sure about whether this provision is actually good or bad. And some of them seems to be irrelevant to the investors, which means that the institutional investors, the large shareholders, do not care much about whether the firm has or do not has these provisions. So the question is, are all these governance provisions matters in corporate governance? There is no priori reason, of course, to expect that all the 24 IRRC provisions contribute to the documented correlation between the G-index in the aggregate and Tobin skew, as well as stock return. Some provisions might have little relevance, and some provision might even be positively correlated with firm value. Some might be more so than others. Furthermore, some provisions might be at least partly the endogenous product of the allocation of power between shareholders and managers set by other provisions. So here we need to answer the question, which provisions are the ones that play a key role in the link between corporate governance and firm value? We began our exploration by identifying a hypothesis for test. Among all these 24 provisions, we find that 6 of them seems to draw substantial attention from the institutional investors. This is what we can observe from the real world. And here what we want to verify is it possible that these 6 provisions contribute the most in shaping the governance structure of the firm? Who are they? Who are these 6 provisions? We attempt to identify the hypothesis for testing the identity of provisions in the IRRC universe that are most responsible for or reflective of managerial entrenchment. And how can we do that? By examining the preferences registered by institutional investors and, of course, other shareholders in votes on precatory resolutions seems to be an objective and natural approach. And of course, shareholders might be mistaken. Even institutional investors can be wrong, but given that they have focused their attention and opposition on some provisions and not on others, then these provisions should be deemed to be potentially significant. So based on data concerning the incidence and outcomes of shareholder precatory resolution, the 4 types of precatory resolution targeting 6 IRRC provisions stand out. The first one is staggered board. Remember that staggered board is a board in which directors are divided into separate classes, typically 3, with each class being elected to overlapping terms. So with staggered board, usually it takes more than 3 years for an outside reader to replace all board members and take formal control of the firm. The second provision is limitation on amending bylaws. This provision is actually limiting shareholders' ability through majority votes to amend the corporate bylaws. The third one is similar. It's limitation on amending the charter. This provision limits shareholders' ability through majority vote to amend corporate charters. The next provision is the supermajority. This requirement requires more than a majority of shareholders to approve a merger. So in order to trigger merger and acquisition activity, you need to gain support from more than 50% of the current shareholder. The next one is the famous golden parachute. It's a severance agreement that provides benefits to management and board members in the event of firing, demotion, or resignation following a change in control, but usually from merger and acquisition, from hostile takeover. The last one is poison pill. This is considered to be a shareholder right that is triggered in the event of an authorized change in control that typically renders the target company financially unattractive or dilutes the voting power of the acquired. So here are 6 of them, and other 18 IRRC provisions do not come even close to the above 6 IRC provision in terms of being the target of a significant number of opposing resolution, obtaining majority support among shareholders. So among all these governance provisions, these 6 of them has gained most of the disconsent from the shareholder, and the other provision seems to be indifferent for the investors. So we construct a new index based on these 6 provisions. Here we label it entrenchment index or E index. This is because we think that the presence of each of these provisions are most responsible for managerial entrenchment. So the great majority of the IRRC provisions and all the IRRC provisions that we hypothesize matter are those that appear to provide incumbents at least nominally with protection for removal or the consequences of removal. We refer those protection as entrenchment. The entrenchment can have negative effects on management behavior and incentives by weakening the disciplinary threat of removal and thereby increasing shirking, empire building, and extraction of private benefits by incumbent management team. So in this panel, it shows us the incidence of each provision. Here, obviously, we focus on staggered board, limits to amend bylaws, limits to amend charters, supermajority, golden parachute, and poison pill. This number tells us how many percentage of the company is associated with a specific provision. And from this number, we can find that staggered boards, golden parachutes, and poison pill are the most common, with each present in a majority of the company. More than a half of the firm actually is with the presence of staggered board, golden parachutes, and poison pills. Incidence of golden parachutes has been increasing steadily. Incidence of staggered boards and poison pills has been relatively stable. Well, incidence of supermajority provision has been declining slightly. Of these 6 provisions, the only one that does not have a substantial presence is provisions that limit charter amendment. The lower panel shows the incidence of the entrenchment E-index. So this tells us that how many percentage of the firm is associated with a certain level of E-index. So based on how we construct this entrenchment index, we know that the E-index should range from 0 to 6. Each company is given a score from 0 to 6 based on the number of these provisions that the company has in the given year. So accordingly, each firm in each year will have an E-index score between 0 to 6. So from this table, it can be concluded that there was a moderate upward trend in the level of E-index during this sample period. Okay, from 1990 to 2002, the E-index seems to be slightly increased. And what we want to do is to investigate the relationship between E-index and firm value. So in this table, the dependent variable is Tobin's Q. Okay, we usually use Tobin's Q to measure firm value empirical. And the key variable of our interest is the E-index itself. Well, in column 2 and column 4, we also try to include dummies, indicating whether the E-index of the firm equals 1, 2, 3, and so on. And we threw other 18 provisions into an O index, and other provision index. And from the regression, we can find that even after controlling for the rest of the IRRC provisions, the entrenchment provisions, both individually and in the aggregate, are negatively correlated with Tobin's Q. And increases in our E-index are correlated in a monotonic and economically significant way with lower Tobin's Q value. Moreover, the provisions in the E-index appear to be largely driven the correlation that the IRRC provision in the aggregate have with Tobin's Q. Because we find no evidence that the 18 provisions not included in index are negatively correlated either in aggregate or individually with Tobin's Q. So E-index has a very significant negative impact on firm value. However, other 18 provisions do not have any significant correlation with firm value. Here is the conclusion and implication. Our results indicate that this kitchen sink approach of shareholder advisory firm might be misguided. Among a large set of governance provisions, the provisions of real significance are likely to constitute only a limited and possibly small subset. Okay, only 6 of them out of 24 provisions. And as a result, an index that gives weight to many provisions that do not matter, and as a result, underweight the provision that do matter, is likely to provide a less accurate measure of governance quality than an index that focuses only on the subset of them. So the E-index provides a measure that can be used and is already being used in a large number of studies by researchers seeking to use in their tests for governance measure not influenced by the noise produced by the other IRRC provisions. The 6 provisions in the E-index are those which researchers as well as private and public decision makers should pay most attention. In constructing the E-index, we have followed the standard approach of giving each of the provisions an equal weight and not making these weights conditional on the presence or absence of other provisions that might interact with it. So in the future, maybe we can try improving this index by exploring the possibility that some of the provisions in the E-index matter more than others, and that interactions among them are important. For example, having a combination of a staggered board and a present queue. Shareholder advisory firms, including industry leader ISS, have put forward index of good corporate governance based on a massive number of provisions. In any large set of governance provisions, many are likely not to matter or to be an endogenous product of others. So compared with a governance rating scheme based on the key provisions that matter, a governance rating system based on a much larger set can push firms in directions that are counterproductive or at least wasteful, and provides a noisier measure of governance quality. So shareholders and their advisors might do well to focus on those corporate governance provisions that really matter for firm value. And lastly, here is also a minor issue related to international corporate governance practice. What we find so far is based on IRRC dataset. And this IRRC dataset is US-centric in that it focuses on features that are important for companies without a controlling shareholder that are dominant in the US capital market, but not in most other capital markets around the world. So here is another potential improvement in how we measure corporate governance level. So that's all for section number 1. Okay, in this section, we basically introduce what is corporate governance, why it's important, how does it affect firm value, and in what way. Okay, so next I'm going to play a video. This video will tell us something about the Enron scandal. Actually, there is a very famous movie about Enron scandal named Enron, the smartest guys in the room. And this video is a brief talk about this documentary. So it takes about 10 minutes for this video. And at the meantime, please write down your name and your student number in our chat board for taking attendance. Okay, so you will have 10 minutes to watch this video and also take attendance.
Of acumen, the smartest guy in the room is the story of the energy giant's Enron scandal of the century. The moment the wealth was lost, the process of destruction was instantly initiated. Information was destroyed and 0 billion insider trading was discovered. How many financial loss was hidden behind the scenes? 20,000 employees lost their jobs and $2 billion in severance pensions was reduced to ashes. Chairman Lay is the real American dream. A man who came from a humble background and aspired to make a name for himself. He earned a PhD in economics and foresaw early on that the energy market would be unbundled. He actively lobbied the government and became the champion of business freedom in Washington. In 1985, Lay used his divine power of this deregulated government to establish Enron. He made extensive acquisition of natural gas assets, and everything was money-oriented. The Bush family and Lay became the closest political and cooperate partner in U.S. history. And Bush, big and small, lobbied for him and obtained billions of government grants. He wrapped himself in ethics, but did the most unethical things. Enron Oil became his first gamble. General Manager Bogarts embezzled more than $3 million and was denounced for making credit accounts. Instead, Lay asked him to continue to make Enron earn big money. With Bogarts sent as jail, who is the next person to help him make money? Geoff Skilling, the king of ideas, appears, but he has a condition to join the company, asking to use the principle of same-day market price accounting, which allows the settlement of future profits on the day of signing. That is to say, the profits themselves, which opens a brand new door for Enron to make money and is also an ambush for future distinction. Skilling saw risks as glory, became an Enron legend by leading call numbers and customers to extreme sports. Stock soared. Chairman Lay sold out for Enron and put on a great show to convince corporate Americans that they were smarter than anyone else. The company predicted 10 to 15% annual growth, taking various controversial practices to reach the amount. We like to take risks because making money depends on taking risks, yet actual profits have not improved. Enron spent billions on global natural gas exploration, but most of the results were ineffective. Desperate for profit, Enron bought Portland Power on the west coast of the United States and entered the California power generation industrial. Enron's stock price rose to 90% in 2000. It was an index stock on Wall Street and was named one of the most represented companies by Fortune magazine. Yet, no one could answer the simple question: where did Enron make so much money? The emperor's new clothes were pork and product, and Enron's financial problems surfaced to the forefront. Treasurer Andy Fastow turned consecutive years of deficit into fantastic numbers, and hid the fact that it was $30 billion in debt. He coaxed Wall Street into submission, and 96 well-known banks invested in his short-selling company LJM, betting against Enron stock, turning Enron into trading collateral, and investors into useful idiots. Enron made a new move to get rich, and the large cover power lines rocked California. The century-old company that provides stable power supply for the citizen was turned into a casino by Enron. The electricity that maintained people's livelihood was sold around like an orange. We made $500 million for Enron. We can definitely retire by 30. Traders threw ethics out the window and took advantage of policy loopholes and California's rules to profit for Enron. No one stopped to consider what was in it for California itself to be completely screwed. Why did this room of smart people collectively choose to trade unethically? Scientist Stanley's experiments found widespread human evil, which confirms Enron's collective loss of the ability to know right from wrong. California paid $30 billion in this electricity price gamble. Citizens protested angrily against Skilling. Enron turned himself into a deck of cards for the open-door policy, and the player number one, Lay, held the ace in his hand. his good friend, President Bush. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission refused to interfere with California's electricity problem, and the chairman of the FERC was recommended by Aaron to serve. In the end, the Senate voted to set a cap on electricity price to save California. Former California Governor Davis took the blame, and actor Arnold Schwarzenegger was appointed governor. In August 2001, to everyone's surprise, Skilling abruptly left, and the shoe rat race began to flee, with Chairman Lay taking over. When Aaron's dark secrets are uncovered, Vice President Watkins is the first to openly ask questions. She discovered that the financial officer Fastow has been creating accounts and using his complicated connection behind the scenes to guarantee Aaron's stock price. Just as Lay swore to the crowd that Aaron's business was solid and Fastow was upright, Aaron's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, destroyed Aaron's files, and the next day Fastow was dismissed and embezzled $45 million. Behind him was huge interest, including the banks involved, such as Chase, JP Morgan, and Citi. Billions of dollars in loans. The law from Arthur Andersen and the entire Aaron brand of directors. On December 2, 2001, Aaron declared bankruptcy. The building with more than 30,000 employees collapsed, along with the American dream and the pension of the grassroots employees. The dream woke up and one of them chose to commit suicide. Conviction pleaded guilty to 50, found guilty of 6. 1 not guilty, 11 not convicted. 3 California traders plead guilty to money transfer fraud. 4 Merrill Lynch executives convicted or fired. Bankruptcy resulted in 20,000 employees losing their jobs and health insurance. Average severance paid of $4,500. Top executives received bonuses totaling $55 million. Employees lose $1.2 billion in pensions and $2 billion in retirement benefits. Executives sell $160 million in stock. Can intelligence really beat the system? Distorted human nature is ultimately to blame. Former finance officer Fastow was forfeited $23 million in assets, and his sentence was reduced to 10 years in exchange for his charges against other top executives. Former CEO Skilling was indicted for insider trading and defrauding investors in 2004. The oldest U.S. accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, collapsed together. Former Chairman Lay was indicted for attempted fraud. When the giant ship sank, the first thing the man at the helm did was to grab his wallet and put himself into a lifeboat after saying to everyone that everything was okay. The smartest of these people also became the greatest. The Aaron incident had a huge impact on the U.S. accounting regulatory system, accounting ethics, and international coordination of accounting. The Aaron incident has put a huge question mark on accounting ethics. As we all know, independence is the core of accounting ethics. Without independence, the assurance function of auditing would be meaningless. However, CPA need to establish a good relationship with their clients, both from the perspective of winning clients and facilitating their work. The SEC's independent rules and the AICPA's ethics clearly require that auditors not only be substantively independent but also remain formally independent. The Aaron incident also affects the development of the international harmonization of accounting to some extent. In the past few years, the International Accounting Standards Committee, IASC, had made a major breakthrough in accounting harmonization. At present, the final obstacle to harmonization lies in the SEC's adjustment of the International Accounting Standards, which are mainly models on British accounting standards. The US has always considered its accounting standards to be the best, But the error instead will make the US reflect on the shortcomings of its accounting standards. The politicization of standard setting is another major criticism of the US accounting model.
Okay, so after we finish chapter 1, in the next section, we are going to talk about shareholders and shareholder activism. A fundamental contradiction in the corporate form of organization is that the dispersed shareholders, collectively, they would have enough incentive to monitor the managers. But for each individual one of them, due to the existence of the free rider problem, they would lack enough incentive to do so. So under this kind of circumstances, distribution of stock ownership appears to be rather important. So empirically, many papers find that there exists a significant correlation between large percentage block shareholding and firm performance. And this kind of relationship can be found in different countries across different periods of time. It's a very robust empirical evidence. And the question is why? Why there is a significant correlation between large shareholding and corporate performance. One possible explanation is that this is the consequence of hostile takeover. The hostile takeover can be more profitable for shareholders who already owns a large block of shares. But this reason cannot completely explain what we find, because the same relation between large shareholding and corporate performance also exists in countries and time periods in which there is no possibility of a hostile takeover. So another explanation comes from the other actions taken by the block holders. Most of those large shareholders are informed, sophisticated institutional investors. So they will initiate investor activism to intervene firm decisions. So in order to explore the possibility of the second explanation, people start to investigate the impact of those shareholder actions. At the beginning, usually the initiator of shareholder activism are pension funds. However, in recent years, hedge funds start to attract attention of the crowd. Hedge fund is a very special type. It's an institutional investor with very special features. Usually, they are more willing to make substantial investment in engagement with companies. Generally speaking, activist shareholder mounted proxy fights and takeover bids. The activist hedge fund do not do so. They do not commonly seek to acquire the company by themselves. Instead, they try to affect how the firm is managed, or to get the company to be acquired by someone else. And the problem here would be that these hedge funds usually contact the company, usually communicate with the management team privately. Therefore, it's difficult for us to obtain public information or open database to understand how hedge fund activism works. Okay, how can the hedge fund affect firm performance and firm decisions? When we talk about the impact of shareholder activism, people usually would be mostly interested in how does it affect firm performance? How can shareholder activism improve profitability of the firm? When the shareholder trigger a proxy fight, usually it will be followed by takeover activities. So are those activists producing value for firms and their fellow shareholders? Or are they hurting their fellow shareholders and only benefit themselves? This kind of studies are very meaningful for the real world. It has important policy implications. If the shareholder activism is beneficial, then we should support for strengthening shareholder rights. And on contrary, if shareholder activism is not beneficial to most of the shareholder, then we should provide support for constraining them. For now, the net effect of institutional activism is still not clear. So are they producing a collective good, or are they destroying value at the expense of other investors? We cannot make conclusive evidence. And what even worse is that the communication between those institutional investors and the firm now become more and more private. Which makes it even more difficult for us to evaluate shareholder activism. So the consequence is that most of the studies, especially those studies about hedge fund activism, are actually case studies. Okay? Each of them is based on a single case. For example, there is a large US pension fund called TIAA-CREF. TIAA-CREF typically does not ask firms to make large operational changes, but is usually successful at inducing firms to make the relatively small changes they ask for, such as having a shareholder vote before adopting blank check preferred stock, or having women or minority representatives on their board of directors. Another case study is about a UK-focused fund. This fund has been highly involved with activism and also has been unusually successful, earning abnormal annual returns net of fees. And how can it do that? By affect firm strategies, such as convincing the firm to be refocusing on the core business, returning more cash to shareholders, or replacement of the CEO or chairman. So these case studies are good. It helps us a lot by understanding how shareholder activism works and how those institutional investors affect firm decisions. And the problem with case study is that it does not representative. It's difficult for us to tell whether it is still true in a general large sample. So before we talk about the benefits of shareholder activism, we need to first get some basic idea about the concepts. First, what is shareholder activism? Gillian and Starks in their 2007 paper has defined activists as investors who, dissatisfied with some aspect of a company's management or operations, and try to bring about change within the company without a change in control. Due to all kinds of limitations, even the activist investor seldom own enough ownership of the firm to formally control the company. So what they need to do is to convince the board of directors or convince the large shareholder. Activists rarely own a controlling stakes. And without control, what they need to do is persuade the board of directors or the majority of shareholders that adopting their proposal is in the best interest of the company. This is because they cannot force their ideas on their target companies. And there are different types of shareholder activism. The first one is soft activism. Why it is soft? Because it usually refers to private communication, and we call it jawballing. They can communicate with the incumbent managers to induce some in-person discussion, or they can just call the CEO or exchange of letters and emails. Okay, in a very soft way, they try to convince the incumbent manager to implement changes. The second type of shareholder activism is called voice mechanism. It usually refers to proxy fights or takeover bids. Okay, this voice mechanism are observable actions taken by the shareholder. The last type of shareholder activism is exit. It usually means that I'm a shareholder of the firm, am unhappy with the manager. I'm disagree with firm decision. Therefore, I sell my shareholding of the firm. Okay, I completely liquidate my holding of the firm's shares and leave the firm. Here is a typical simplified model of shareholder activism. Firm is controlled by its board of directors. Ideally, board only cares about shareholder value, also has private benefit from keeping the status quo. So even though there is no agency problem associated with the board, okay, the board would be preferred to live a quiet life, because living a quiet life can reduce the working load and can decrease the probability of making any mistakes. The activist investor has information that the board does not have. So in a shareholder activism at the beginning, these activists will try to send the board this private message. And then the activists observe the board's response and does one of the following. First, do nothing, remain hesitant, and let the board to implement the changes. Second, sell their shares in the company and exit. Last one, exercise their voice by launching a public campaign to change the status quo. They lobby other shareholders and start a proxy fight. This is a real-life shareholder activism. The activist hedge fund is called Elliott Management. It initiated a dialogue with senior management of BMC Software about exploring pathways together to create greater value for stockholders. And BMC responded by issuing a press release and adopting a poison pill, which can be considered as a very negative response to the kind and friendly action taken by the hedge fund. So Elliott wrote a letter to board members of BMC Software to explain their actions. And shortly after that, Elliott nominated directors and pushed for the sale of BMC, which had been acquired a year later. So in this case, who is the activist investor?
Elliott Management.
Elliott Management, yes. Elliott Management is unhappy with BMC's incumbent management team. So at the beginning, it tried to draw Boeing with the incumbent management team. Okay, they want to do it quietly, but it failed. Okay, the response from the management team is very unpleasant. So then they try to communicate with the board. And again, they fail. So they trigger a formal proxy fight, okay, which is followed by a formal acquisition. So this case tells us that in real world, okay, in real life, most of the time, a formal shareholder activism, such as proxy fight or takeover bid, is due to the failure of private communication. There is another real-life case of shareholder activism. At the beginning, some investors choose to exit if their ideas are rejected. Okay, for example, according to this guy, David, from Greenlight Capital, when we first offer companies private advice, they either take it or they explain why they are not going to take it. Sometimes we agree to disagree and then decide whether to hold the stock or exit the position. So here we have another new question. Given that any shareholder can sell their holding of the company and leave, would that kind of mechanism, would this exit mechanism make the private communication between the shareholder and the firm to be less effective? Is that so? So here we have two questions. Okay, the first one, how does the threat of voice affect the effectiveness of soft activism? Whether it improves the communication or make it even worse. Given that the shareholder can launch a proxy fight or start a takeover bid, would this kind of threat make it good, or say improve or disimprove the private communication? B, why is that?
I think it theoretically, I think it should improve the communication
Yeah,
between the
improve.
the investors and the manager.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the answer should be A, right?
Yes.
Yes. So why some shareholder activism does not work out? Most of the time, this is because the activists try to communicate with the management but fail to do so. So suppose you are an activist investor and try to convince the board to support you and make the changes. How are you going to do this? First, you will try to demonstrate that the benefits of implementing the changes. Okay, why you want to make the changes? Why is that good for the firm? And then second, stress that if no change, you are going to take other actions, such as initiate a proxy fight and vote the resistant directors out. So therefore, the threat of voice actually improve the effectiveness of communication. Okay, if the communication does not work out, we will do other things. which is even worse for the company, which is even worse for the board. Okay. And the second question, given that the activists can exit, can sell all their stakes in the firm anytime they want, would it make the communication with the management less effective? Think about it. This one is more difficult than the first question because the logic is actually quite indirect. The answer is no. So here's the logic. To convince the board and other shareholders to make the changes, the activists sometimes will overstate the benefit of implementing the changes. Okay, the improvement is not that good, but in order to convince the others, they will overstate the benefit. And when this exit mechanism is available, the activist is less likely to do so. So the board would understand that, so they are more likely to believe the activist's proposal. So in this case, this exit mechanism actually improves the effectiveness of communication. The easier to leave. When the activists give up exiting and choose to convincing the board to accept the change, it implies that the benefit of changes would be bigger, and the board would be easier to get convinced. Okay? That's why this exit mechanism actually improves the effectiveness of communication. So from these two questions, we can understand that different type of shareholder activism actually is complementary to each other. So existence or effectiveness of one type of shareholder activism actually help to improve the effectiveness of the other. All right, next we are going to talk about the benefits of activism. So everything began when the entrepreneur has one idea or an investment project that requires outside financing. Suppose there is an investment project which is associated with the setup cost I, okay, the initial investment. And however, the entrepreneur only has A, and here A is smaller than I. So the entrepreneur does not have enough capital to invest in this product by himself. And here A is the so-called initial equity inside equity entrepreneurial networks. Okay, so it's how much money the entrepreneur can put in this project. The entrepreneur equity can have many different forms. It could be cash. It could be the value of the entrepreneur's collateral or the salvage value of the assets at the end of the production process. So apparently, the entrepreneur needs to raise funds from outside investors. Okay? He needs at least I minus A from outside investor to be able to invest in this project. And we know that the entrepreneur is protected by limited liabilities, which means that his income cannot take negative values. And in addition to that, we do not consider to discounting our cash flow. So we do not discount the future, okay, to simplify our question. Now, what we know about the outcome stage is that if this investment project is successful, then the return would be capital R. And if this investment project fail, then we will get nothing. The return would be 0. And the probability that this project is going to be successful is small p. So that the probability of this project to be failed would be 1 minus small p. The agency problem arises when this probability is endogenous, which means that there will be conflict of interest between the entrepreneur and the outside investor when the probability of succeed can be manipulated by the manager. If the entrepreneur choose to work hard or say choose to behave good, then the probability of success would be higher. It would be pH. If he choose not to work hard or he choose to shirk and misbehave, then the probability of success would be lower. It would be only PL. And obviously PL is lower than pH. And we say that pH minus PL will equal to delta P. And delta P is strictly positive. However, at the meantime, if the entrepreneur chooses to shirk and misbehave, he can enjoy a private benefit capital B. This private benefit capital B is also strictly positive. Here the question is, when would outside investors to be willing to finance this project? When would they be willing to provide money to this project? So usually in our corporate finance class, we say that we require the net present value of the project to be positive. But in the real world, this is not enough. If we assume that investment is worth funding only if the financial contract with the investors induces the entrepreneur to behave, okay, which means that the entrepreneur must be compensated more in the case of success than in the case of failure. So therefore, if the investment project fails, then the entrepreneur will get nothing. Okay, this is what we already know. If fail, the entrepreneur get nothing. But if the project is success, then the entrepreneur will get paid by RB. So this RB should be enough to induce him to forego the private benefit of misbehaving. Therefore, the RB should be this one. So this RB should be higher or equal to capital B divided by delta P. It means that the outside investor have to sacrifice some of the return from this project. Otherwise, it cannot incentivize the entrepreneur to work hard. Well, however, at the same time, the outside investor need to be properly rewarded to induce them to be willing to invest in this project. So first of all, we need to remember that we must assume that only if the financial contract can induce the entrepreneur to behave good, to work hard, then this project is worth funding by the outside investor. This is because at this time, the project is associated with higher probability of success. Okay, so here, let's focus on the right-hand side of this inequation. At this time, it equals to the probability of success multiplied by how much money the outside investor can get when the project is succeed. And how much money the outside investor can be rewarded when the project succeeds. Okay, it equals to the total return to this project minus how much money they pay to the entrepreneur. So this is the left-hand side of this inequation. How about the right-hand side? The right-hand side is the initial investment of the outside investors. Okay, so the return to outside investor must be higher or equal to their initial investment. And that's when the outside investor would be willing to put their money in this project. So for the competitive market in equilibrium, the equation will hold. And this is the point when the outside investor just break even. If the outside investor just break even, then the entrepreneur will receive a positive net surplus, which equals to the NPV of the project. This is because when the return to the outside investor equals to their initial investment, then how much money the entrepreneur can get will equals to this, okay, which happens to be the net present value of the project. So we can summarize our basic model, okay, where we start with. So in the absence of monitoring, shirking provides private benefit capital B. And here that RB denotes the entrepreneur's reward in the case of success. In order to incentivize the manager to work hard, it requires that this RB should be larger than capital B divided by delta P. And in order to induce the outside investor to be willing to put their money in our projects, it requires that the pledgeable income of those outside investors, this one, should be higher than their initial investment. So if this condition is satisfied, and given that the outside investor break even, then the entrepreneur's utility would be equal to the project's NPV. Okay, so here is what we begin when there is completely no monitoring. So next week, we are going to figure out how monitoring is going to reduce moral hazard problem. A straightforward way of doing so is to assume that a monitor can reduce the private benefit that can be enjoyed by the entrepreneur by shirking from capital B to small b. And obviously, we accept that monitoring is also associated with cost, and this monitoring cost would be equals to C. C is strictly positive, but is unknown. It's an all observable private information. Okay, so today we would end here. and we will talk about the extension of this basic model next week.